I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, traditional owners of the land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as acknowledging that we're all here today on different lands, and so acknowledge traditional owners of all the lands from wherever you join us today. It's a tough one to do today. Housekeeping, we have an 11 a.m. We'll have a little break at 11 a.m., a little stretch break. This session goes for 2 hours. So we'll have a quick stretch break and grab a cup of tea break. We'll get back into it. Apart from that, you know where your fire exits and your toilets are. I don't need to point those out. I want to introduce to you, so this session is all about governance. Now, by Susan's own admission, this may sound very boring, but it is the glitter and the glue that holds everything together. So they are going to be, between Juanita and Susanna, who will be presenting today, they're going to be spreading some magic fairy dust and making all things governance exciting. I am absolutely sure. I've seen their videos. So Susan is a senior solicitor at the Arts Law Centre of Australia, where she has worked for over 7 years. Susan's worked for a number of community legal centres and a boutique entertainment law practice. She provides legal advice on copyright, contract, defamation, debt and business structure, and enjoys educating artists and businesses about their rights and providing practical advice across a wide range of areas. Juanita is also a lawyer and consultant specialising in the for-purpose sector. She has 20 years' experience in not-for-profit governance and leadership, admitted to legal practice in 2005. Juanita commenced her legal career at Allens, Linklaters and the Federal Court of Australia before spending almost a decade at Justice Connect as the head of not-for-profit law. More recently, she held a role as General Counsel and Company Secretary at climate advocacy organisation. It's even hard for me to say, it's that smart. The Sunrise Project, and last year founded Trellis Work, a boutique consulting advisory agency. So you guys are in the best possible hands. And I know there has been questions around, hi Sophie, I know there has been questions around governance and structuring organizations. So I know you're going to get so much value out of this. So I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Juanita and Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Great to be here and wonderful to see some familiar faces on the call, Arthur and Anston, and to be joined by Juanita. I just want to start by acknowledging that I am joining from Lutruwita, Tasmania this morning. I've got the beautiful Cunnamalooka River about a 5-minute walk from my house. So I'm very fortunate to be on lands that have been cared for and maintained by the Aboriginal elders, who I acknowledge and pay my respects to this morning. I'm very, very excited to be delivering this for the 2nd year in a row with Juanita. And as Kelly said at the beginning, this governance workshop is really about helping you to understand how the glue on an organisation that does lots of exciting things works, so that all the glitter sticks, all of the exciting bits stick. So you've got to have a well-built, well-governed organisation in order for that to work. So we've been brought along very happily by the Office of the 24-Hour Economy Commissioner to talk a bit about governance. And just so that for anyone who's not aware or hasn't seen these resources, Arts Law and the 24-Hour Economy Commissioner have also worked on developing a number of key resources to assist you. Juanita's been critical in the development of those resources. And so they include things like a draft template constitution for you to use, a governance guide, which is a booklet that will guide you through a lot of the content that we're talking about today when you want to spend some time just reading through it and at your own pace, and also 3 videos on some core governance concepts. So have a look at those. Just so that you're aware, the Arts Law Centre is not a government organisation. We're a not-for-profit organisation that supplies support to or provides support to artists and arts organisations about their legal issues. And you can find out more about what we do on our website. I'll hand over to Juanita to introduce herself, and we'll just go, yep, great, thanks Juanita, into the slideshow. it would also be useful before we kick off if people could let us know whether you are currently a member of an incorporated association. If you don't know, or the answer is yes or no, pop it into the chat for us. Over to you, Anita.
Hello. Thank you, Suzanne. And can I just check that everyone can hear me? Yep. All good. Thanks very much. And as Suzanne mentioned, it's a pleasure for us both to be here today to talk about governance. I love the glitter and the glue. We'll keep that in mind as we go through today's session. Yeah, I think it is true that if you don't have the glitter and the glue, what kind of party can you throw, really? I'm just going to check that all my tech is working okay. We have done an acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to add my acknowledgement of country. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people here in Melbourne. I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge that we are living, working and playing on unceded sovereign Aboriginal land. We've got a little bit of a poll there around what, who is incorporated. I'd love to just check that, because we're going to move from that question into another question, which is, why is governance important? And those, it'd be interesting to see those who are incorporated versus those who aren't, and their takes on this question. So I'm seeing here on the chat that it's probably about 50-50 at the moment, incorporated versus not incorporated. Yep, there's questions about business names in there as well. So thanks for that. That's great to know, because it will help us to make sure that today's conversation is relevant to you, if we know that, your incorporation status. And we'll come to that. If you don't know what incorporation is and not sure whether you are or not, that's totally fine. Many organisations aren't aware of the glitter and the glue. So we'll be going through that today as well. But first of all, can I just, I guess, ask or pose this question? Why is governance important, do you think? And what do you think we mean by it? Does anyone want to? I'm not sure if we're just going to use the chat today for questions. Is that right? Fantastic. Yes. So does anyone want to contribute anything in the chat around why governance is important? Thank you, Latha. Robust decision-making, absolutely. Keeping us honest. Yes, very good. Thank you, Nick. We have a lot of governance. It's important to formalise consensus and collaboration. Yeah, thanks, Sophie. And governance, good governance can really help an organisation know what sorts of decision-making processes it's going to use for what sorts of decisions, and that can make things run smoothly. Sets the rules of the game. Thanks, Raymond. Yes, absolutely. And act in the best interests of the business. Angela, we're going to come back to those very words a little bit later on. In terms of the duties of committee members, or board directors, as they are sometimes called. Accountability and transparency. Thank you. This is all excellent. You're all on the right path here. Conflict resolution. Thank you, Iris. Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. I feel like, there's a basis for some great conversations in just those chat responses right now. So thank you all for contributing. I just wanted to say that good governance really can mean the difference between the success or failure of an organisation. And I've put here on the screen a little media grab from an organisation in London, a district association. So they have lots of them in the UK. A little bit of a different arrangement to here in New South Wales, but for you in New South Wales, but nevertheless, common district associations. And this one won the Best Visitor Information Initiatives Award, the Best Community Project Award, Best Partnership Award. So good governance can underpin success of an organisation. Absolutely. On the other hand, bad governance can mean that things go wrong. So you'll see here a little snip from a court case in New York where a district association was actually taken to court. And, you know, as we'll discover through this webinar today, that is definitely something that can happen if things really go wrong. Now, I hurry to say that court cases against not-for-profit organisations are really very rare, but it is something that can go wrong if you're a district association and your governance is not strong. And here again, this third grab shows a media clip about an organisation, again, I think in the UK, that didn't manage to navigate its community very well and ended up in a big sort of stoush and lots of adverse media around its undemocratic processes. So good governance can really help an organisation demonstrate that it's being fair, that it understands the rules of the game and it's playing by them, if you like. Okay, so the aim of this session is to give you the background and skills to incorporate your group and manage governance effectively, which will set you up for legal compliance and, more importantly, a big, fantastic district association party with lots of glitter and bound together by excellent glue. Top notch, top shelf. If we think then about good governance questions, the sorts of questions that you might be asking yourselves when you're thinking about governance. Things like, why does this group exist? Who are the people that the organisation represents, and how do they have a say? Now, governance is really about the big picture of an organisation. Often an organisation will have staff or volunteers that are dealing with the day-to-day matters. And governance is really, you know, strategically and big pictures, in a big picture sense, who's taking care of the organisation. And as at the fourth dot point there, you know, that can be contrasted with who's in charge of the everyday business. We'll go through that in a little more in a moment, but in a broad brush sense, it's the committee or the governing body of an organisation that is doing the governance work, and that can be distinct from, as I say, those staff or volunteers doing the day-to-day. You can think about legal responsibilities, finances, and risks, all really crucial parts of good governance, and we will be looking at all of those areas in this session today. Now, I just wanted to acknowledge as well that the larger the organisation is, the more formalised it will be. So you can look at these questions and think about it in a tiny little unincorporated, you know, not-for-profit organisation operating very much at a grassroots local level. But these same questions can and should be and are asked by really large corporations. So it's just that the concepts are the same, but obviously the way that they play out in practice is calibrated to the size and complexity and scope of your organisation. Okay, so what are we covering today? We're going to go through knowing your legal structure, and for those who are incorporated or aren't, we can spend some time talking about what that means and what your options are in terms of incorporation for those who are not yet incorporated. Secondly, we'll go through understanding your rules. Now, for many of your types of your organisations, you may call this a constitution, quite the word of the moment. So we can talk about what constitutions are, the template constitution that we've developed in partnership with the 24-Hour Economy Commissioner for the Uptown project, and some of the key clauses and requirements in that constitution. Then we'll go through duties of committee members. And as will become apparent, committee members, the people who are on that committee, have particular legal duties vis-a-vis the organisation that trusts them to do the governing work. Then, after a short break, Suzanne's going to come and talk about IP, intellectual property, and contracts. And we'll round out today's session with a brief overview of risk management and bring it all together with a practical scenario at the end there. So I just wanted to say as well, you'll see that on this list, we are not dealing with charity law. Now, many organizations that are incorporated as not-for-profits can also be charities, but we're not going to be covering charity law today. There's the ACNC website that sets out lots of information about charities, and if any of your organizations are considering being registered as charities, you might need to go and get some additional assistance to help you navigate rules and requirements for charity status, but yeah, we're not going to deal with that today. Okay, so moving along to knowing your legal structure. And it's knowing what your legal structure is and the rules and regulations that come with that are really important for your group. You don't have to be incorporated for the law to recognise a community group. The law will recognise a group of people who come together for a common purpose as an unincorporated association. That's something that the law recognises. But at a certain point, there are particular benefits for groups to start to become more formal in the way that they operate, and that is through the incorporation process. So let's talk about incorporation. What is it? Does anyone want to offer a definition of incorporation in the chat? Does anyone feel like they know what that is? It's a bit of a conceptual sort of question. I'll just allow a little moment for anyone who feels like they want to. Aha, Latha. Have I got your name? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Latha?
Latha. Hi,
Latha. Thank you very much, Latha. Yes, becoming a new legal person as a group. Excellent. That is really one of the fundamental propositions of incorporation, being recognised by law. Raymond, thank you very much. Yes, and the process by which an organisation becomes recognised by law as a separate legal person is through registering that organisation with government and setting it up in certain ways. So an incorporated organisation is registered with the government as and becomes a separate legal entity from the members, from the people who make it up. That means, so if I represent that here, we can see that there's that line coming around the people there, so that the entity itself, the corporate entity, becomes a thing as distinct from the individuals or persons, who make up that group, I suppose. So that means that the group itself can do things like own property. The organisation itself can enter into contracts, so it can get insurance, it can enter into a funding agreement. It can also, as we saw in the first slide, it can sue and be sued. So it's like a legal person. Now, also, the other kind of really important concept of incorporation is that concept of the liability of members is limited. Sometimes it's just called limited liability. You might have heard that term around about. But what that really means is that if an organisation winds up or ends and it's got some debts, then for the most part, the members are not liable, that means responsible, to pay that money on behalf of the organisation. So it means that the members' liability is limited. The members themselves are not responsible for the financial position of the organisation per se. So that's a really protective factor for members coming from the incorporation process. And that's often why organisations wish to incorporate. So if you are looking to incorporate, you need to decide on the type of incorporation you're going to explore. Now, many organisations who are in the Uptown project, so your organisations, will choose to be incorporated as not-for-profit organisations. Now, what does not-for-profit actually mean? Sounds simple. But many people sometimes make the mistake that not-for-profit means that an organisation can't make any money, can't make any profit at all. That is not true. A not-for-profit organization can make money. It can have a bank account, and at the end of the year, it can have some money left in it. That is absolutely fine. In fact, good governance would say that's a prudent and appropriate way for an organization to operate. What makes it a not-for-profit is what is done with that money. Now, in a corporation, a for-profit company, many of you will be aware that if you're a shareholder of that for-profit company, then you can be paid a dividend. If the company is doing very well, then you can get a dividend, and you get some money paid to you personally, and you go, woohoo, fantastic, this company did well this year, and here's my payment. And you can go off and do whatever you want with that money. That is not allowed in a not-for-profit organization. The money that's made by the organization has to be put back into the organization to continue to do its not-for-profit work. So it can't be distributed to members for them to do whatever they want with it as a kind of like in the way that a dividend is in a for-profit company. These concepts are explored much more in arts law and the 24-Hour Economy Commissioner's Governance Guide. So if you'd like to know more about incorporation and the entity types, then please have a look there. But there are a number of different not-for-profit entity types. Some of them, any of them can be registered as charity. And as I say, we're not going to go into that too much today. But there's a company limited by guarantee, for example. You could incorporate as a cooperative. Or you can incorporate as a incorporated association. They're all not-for-profit structures. Some of them are states, some of them are Commonwealth. We think that the most likely type of entity that your groups will be incorporating as is an incorporated association in New South Wales. Can I get I'm just going to go back through the comments here to see which organisations that are incorporated are actually incorporated as not-for-profit incorporated associations in New South Wales. At least one. And I suspect that there are more. You're a not-for-profit, Sophie? Yep. Do you know what type of structure? So is it a state-based structure, which is usually an incorporated association?
I don't know the complexity of the partnership, structure. I can find out. But for us, we're looking at how can we create a sort of a separate affiliated kind of group that can support the placemaking and activation that extends beyond the core partnership of the health and education government partners, right, to a broader placemaking, place-based opportunity.
Okay.
The relationship between the two.
Right. So you're looking to sort of spin out from an existing incorporated entity.
Sort of satellite, wider group, and with sort of thinking about, because we've got a much more diverse, business model evolving as well.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So, on the assumption that most organisations here either are already an incorporated association or might consider the incorporated association structure for their district group, I just want to talk a little bit more about what is an incorporated association. And as I've mentioned, it's one of a number of different legal structures that can be used for a not-for-profit. In New South Wales, you need a minimum of 5 members to incorporate an association. And you register that association with New South Wales Fair Trading. And when it's registered, that's when your incorporation is, approved, and all of those benefits that I mentioned before flow from that. You must have a constitution to be an incorporated association. And the constitution will set out how the organisation is run. We'll talk a little bit more about this shortly. It will also outline the purposes of the organisation. sometimes called objects. And the association must work to achieve those purposes. And as I mentioned earlier, with the concept of not-for-profit, any money made must go back into the organisation to further those purposes. There's lots and lots of information about New South Wales incorporated associations on the Fair Trading website and how to do that, how to register and that sort of thing. The New South Wales Fair Trading website also contains a model constitution, which the government has published to help small groups have a starting place for a constitution that will work for them. So many organisations, when they're just starting out, they will, or even larger ones, they will adopt the model constitution that's published by New South Wales Fair Trading. Now, what we've done as a part of this project is to take that model constitution and to suggest some potential edits that might be useful for you as Uptown participants. But really, what your constitution looks like is to a large extent up to you, as long as it complies with some legal requirements, which we'll come to now. But first of all, I just wanted to pause and ask if there's any questions about any of that. No? Okay, let's go on to knowing your rules, otherwise known as knowing your constitution. So as I mentioned, every New South Wales incorporated association must have a constitution, and there are various topics which must be included in the constitution. They're set out in law. Some of the key ones are listed on this slide. They include members and fees and what the committee looks like, management funds, etc. So yes, thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for that disclaimer, I suppose. Not legal advice, just legal information. Yes, so a constitution is essentially a form of contract, and it can be enforced legally. It's a contract that's binding on the members of the organisation, the committee, and the organisation itself. We don't have time today to go through all of the clauses of the template constitution, which, as I mentioned, are based on the model rules, but I just wanted to point out a couple that I think are of particular relevance for this Uptown context. First of all is purpose. We've already talked a little bit about purpose, but I think it will be important for your groups to consider, what are you set up to do? There's usually a provision in a constitution to express a purpose that guides the organisation and guides its decision-making over the long term. And it can be a really driving factor in working out how to make decisions, what's the organisation stand for, and what is its reason for being. You can look to some other organisations' constitutions for inspiration if you want to, but we've offered a potential starting point in the Uptown template constitution with a purpose something like as follows: to promote, nurture and celebrate the district as a part of Sydney's 24-hour economy, and to support and advocate for the district's industry and cultural development. So as you can see from that, it's quite high level. It's often quite kind of boring, broad language. Don't go too specific would be my suggestion, but it gives a flavour of why the organisation exists. Have a think about that as you think through your incorporation process. The second aspect of a constitution that I wanted to touch on was membership. Who is or should be a member of your district association? How are you going to decide and define who's in and who's out? It's a critical conversation for district associations, and some of those screen grabs on the first page around the media kind of negative press and things have been around organisations which have been accused of operating in an exclusionary way. So having a really robust conversation about the membership of your organisation will set you up well for the long term. Now, depending on what it says in your constitution, members can be real people, individuals, or corporations, or organisations, or they can be both. So have a think about whether you are interested in having businesses as that, separate legal person as a member, or whether you're going to limit your membership to just individuals. You might also consider who, if there are individuals or indeed other organisations, who should be involved. So an example from the Uptown template is that there is a category in the membership fees, right at the end, of a community representative, I should say. Now, if you were to have a bunch of you might have some different types of businesses as your members, but you might like to think about whether or not you open your membership up to non-business, non-trader type members, such as other community members. Perhaps there's a cultural organisation in your area, or a residential complex, and it's appropriate that someone from or people from that cohort are included in your membership. Who gets to decide on membership? Now, in the template constitution that we've developed for the Uptown project, that is the committee. The committee of the organisation gets to decide who will join as a member. But importantly, there is a review process baked in, so that if a person applies for membership and is knocked back by the committee, then there's an avenue for that person to appeal essentially to the whole membership of the organisation and say, can the whole organisation, all members be invited to make a decision on this person's application for membership. Nick has asked, are all members equal if their member fees are different? This is also a matter which you could customise in your constitution, but generally speaking, one member, and certainly in the template, one member equals one vote. So regardless of the fee structure, which really speaks to capacity to pay, once you're in as a member, you have one vote. And that goes to the final point around, to these two final dot points around what rights do members have and what fees do they pay. So typically members actually have relatively limited rights. They can come to the AGM and they can approve certain very major changes for the organisation. But one of those rights is those rights, all of them are really important. And one of them, if you have got a constitution which allows for election of your committee by the membership, then the members are actually deciding who those committee members are. So in that sense, the members have a really important role to play in setting the direction of leadership in the organisation and of governance. Speaking of the committee, the constitution will also need to set out who's on the committee, how many people, and the process by which those people are elected or appointed. So committee members are typically elected by the members, but there are different ways to structure committee processes. Some organisations, for example, will have, say, a certain portion of the committee elected by the members, but then have the capacity for the committee to supplement those elected members with appointed members who tick certain skills boxes, if perhaps the general membership doesn't have a certain skill set that the committee thinks is useful to round out the expertise and skills of the board or the committee. I should mention here, I'm using the word committee for this session because that's the word that's used in the incorporated association legislation and that sort of world. But really, a committee is the same as a board. It's really whatever you call that governing body whether it's a committee or a board, or some people call it a council. It's that governing body that I'm talking about here when I'm talking about the committee. Now, the Uptown template says there are minimum of four committee members: the president, the deputy president, the treasurer, and the secretary, plus up to 5 ordinary members. So you can change this. It doesn't have to be that way. That's just one suggestion. But do have a think carefully about how your committee should be made up and the types of skills that you would want on your committee. Would you want to have representation from certain types of members, certain types of traders, certain types of community representatives on your board? There's lots of ways you could do that. Not all of it has to be in the constitution as such. Sometimes organizations will have something very high level and broad in the constitution, and then they'll supplement that with a policy or a board charter or a committee charter that kind of explains how the organization will approach those decision-making processes. And that's a useful way to go, because a charter or a policy is easier to change over time than the constitution. I feel a bit funny saying that today, because obviously we've not decided as an Australian people not to change our constitution over the weekend. So in a similar vein, all the members, or a significant portion of members, need to vote in favour of a change to the constitution. It's like a little mini country. So, sometimes organisations will keep it quite high level and quite brief at the constitution level, and then, really set it out in more detail in documents underneath that can be revised more easily as circumstances change. Okay, I think that's probably all I need to say on that. Just checking if there are any questions. No, not. Please feel free to keep shooting through those questions in the chat. I am looking at it as I go along. So if there's anything that is not clear or that you'd like more information on, please feel free. I'll go on to meetings. Another thing that is required to be dealt with in the constitution of an incorporated association. There are essentially two types of meetings. There's general meetings, which is meetings of all the members. Now, the most typical meeting of all of the members is the AGM, but there can also be special general meetings if there's a particular issue to consider outside the annual AGM cycle. It can be a bit confusing when you're starting up to kind of get the sense of which business has to go in which meeting. Our governance guide does provide some commentary on that. But it is important, because they do play different roles, to be really careful about what you're discussing at an AGM versus what you're discussing at a different type of meeting, such as a committee meeting, which would not be all the members, just the committee. Some decisions must be made in a general meeting. Others can be made by more regular committee meetings. When you have a meeting, it's the Constitution will set out what sort of notice needs to be provided and what timing. Some types of decisions at general meeting require a particular period of time. So a special resolution, which is a very kind of big decision, I suppose, for the members to make, like changing the constitution or changing the name of the organisation, requires 21 days notice. So you have to kind of have your ducks lined up in terms of, thinking through what your proposal will be and making sure that you're sending out all those papers at least 21 days before the meeting, when the members will be asked to decide. The agenda setting is usually done by the committee in conversation or the chair, and the secretary has responsibility for all of the paperwork associated with that, including also the minutes. You don't have to write down everything that is said at a committee meeting or an AGM or other type of general meeting, just the key points or decisions made. Voting rights is another thing that will be dealt with in the Constitution. Typically, a Constitution will make it very clear that if you haven't paid up your money, your fees, then you can't vote at the AGM on any matters or any other kind of general meeting. Some organisations also allow proxies. Does anyone know what a proxy is? Someone give me a proxy definition in the chat. No. Well, aha, thank you very much, Nick. Very good. You pass your vote to another person. So that's when you basically give another person the opportunity to vote on your behalf. Okay. I'm just going to check time here and yep, good. All right. We're going to go on to the role of the committee now, and I've already talked a little bit about this, but in particular going to explore those duties that committee members are under. Before we do that, I just wanted to pause there and ask if there were any questions. Sophie? Oh, thank you, Sophie. Really appreciate the feedback. I would love to have some examples or suggested formats for our innovation precinct example. There are potentially more or less engaged partners in our existing membership and governance. Okay, well, I'm not quite sure about your innovation precinct example, but I think maybe a place to start would be with the template constitution that we've developed for the Uptown project to just see whether or not the membership provisions in that will suit you, or whether you'd want to be kind of more or less prescriptive about membership, and who from the membership might be, eligible to be elected to the committee, for example.
I think the question is more because we're just a heavy district with the Health and Innovation Partnership. The question is more, should we be thinking about a branch of the existing, incorporated association or whatever structure we have for which is evolving itself for the precinct partnership, and then add on other external partners in one way or the other, or whether or not we need to kind of think about a placemaking entity that sits outside that. And
yeah, that's a really good point. So a couple of reflections on that, and mindful that I don't know your context super well. You don't need to include all of your stakeholders in your membership, and many organizations run into difficulties when they sort of want to get every kind of subscriber to the newsletter or whatever in the organization as a member. If you do that and you end up having a very, very large membership, then it can mean that getting kind of quorum or decision making, getting big decisions made just becomes more complicated. There's a very famous case here in Victoria with Bicycle Victoria, which had, I think thousands of members, and, just trying to get a constitutional change and get that special resolution up, which is as I mentioned earlier, is a particularly, big and quite difficult thing. You have to have 75% of members present and able to vote in favour of that change. So if you've got 1,000 members, that gets really complicated and really hard. So there are other ways that you might choose to engage your stakeholders, but not as members. You could have supporters, that sit outside of your membership structure. You can have funders and recognize them and, celebrate them in your annual report or whatever it is that you do without them having to be members per se. So it's really a call for you in your particular organizational context. The other thing is that obviously you can incorporate multiple entities for different purposes and you can create relationships between them, whether that's informally through mechanisms like an MOU or more formal mechanisms through kind of corporate groups and that sort of thing. Okay, if you have already set up as an unincorporated, can you change to incorporated? I think the answer is yes. If you have an unincorporated group, then yes, that group can choose to go through the process of incorporation. Many unincorporated groups have an informal set of rules or an informal constitution, you'd have to make sure that that governing document did kind of tick all the boxes in terms of what the law requires for your particular incorporation structure. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier with the New South Wales Incorporated Associations, the Constitution has to tick off on, a number of different subject matters in order to be registered. So, you might need to do a little bit of work on what those rules are if you're unincorporated and wanting to transition across to incorporated. But most community groups start out as unincorporated, and then at a certain point, they decide it's worth our while now to become incorporated, whether that's to get the protection of limited liability, to access funding and insurance, to get grants and that sort of thing. There are a range of reasons why. But that's the typical pathway for community organisations. And I hope that answers your question, Kelly. Okay. Let's go on to knowing your duties. Now, can I just ask, what do you think is the role of the committee? Can I get some feedback in the chat on that? So we're talking about that governing body, whether you call it a board or a committee, a group of people who are responsible or elected or appointed, under the Constitution in the way that I've described. What's the point of it? What do they do? What's their role and responsibility? They make decisions benefiting the organisation. So strategy, yep, fantastic. Direction and commitments, to gather motions and make decisions, yes. Risk and financials, yes. Fantastic, yep. So I think you've got actually quite a lot of them there. Strategic direction is really critical, and long term, where's this organisation going? What's going to look like in a couple of years' time, or 5 years or 10 years? How do we set it up for success in that long-term horizon? Purpose, mission, and values. What programs are they going to do? Is the organisation going to do? Making sure it's got adequate resources, so the financials are healthy, managing risks, as you've mentioned. Yes, and Sandy, yes, the committee is that kind of really fundamental governing body responsible for governance, absolutely. Finances in it. Now, if the organisation has staff, then there can be a bit of a difference between the governance duties and role of the committee and the role of the staff. And I mentioned that a little earlier when I said, the committee's role is really that big picture governance, and then the committee will delegate or leave to the staff certain day-to-day management and operational decision-making. So that's good. And I think, when you're sitting on a committee, you won't necessarily be thinking about legal things front and center, but there is a legal dimension to the committee's role as well. And we call this in legal terms a fiduciary duty, which just means really that committee members are held in a position of high trust by the organisation, because the organisation has elected or appointed those people to govern the organisation. It's the same level of duty that a lawyer is under in respect of its client. And I've got a frog in my throat here. Bear with me for one moment. Excuse me. It's also the same duty that a doctor owes to their patient. So it's a very high standard. And we'll go through this a little bit now. Excuse me. Now, it's important to know that if a committee member doesn't meet that very high standard to which they are held, then the protection of limited liability falls away. So if you're on a committee and you're not behaving at the standard expected, then there's a possibility that you may be personally liable for something that goes wrong within the organisation. Again, it's very, very rare for this to happen, but it is worth knowing for those of you who are on the committee, there's a legal dimension to this, and there are legal roles and consequences flowing from that position of high trust. And we're going to go through that now. I'm going to just take 1 second to have a little bit of water though, before we move into this section. Suzanne, could I ask perhaps that you just take over for a moment?
Absolutely. I kept unmuting myself with the intention of doing that, and you battled through. So yeah, and I think just reflecting briefly on a couple of things from the comments on the last slide, are also that while there is that separation between the role of the committee as a strategic risk managing kind of part of the organisation and the staff, it's also very common in small organisations, in small not-for-profits, for the lines to start to blur a little bit, because you might have an organisation that's predominantly made up of volunteers and your staff are really thin on the ground. So you might end up with, board members moving things when the office needs to move locations, and those lines can start to blur. So it's important from time to time for a committee to remind itself of its strategic role in governing an organisation, that it and to from time to time also consider whether it's getting too involved in the operational aspects of the organisation and whether that is beneficial to the organisation. So just jumping to the slide that's here now and talking about the committee member duties, as you can see, we're going to sort of focus on the first two there, which is to act in good faith for a proper purpose, and secondly, to act with reasonable care, skill and diligence. And I'm getting a thumbs up from Juanita. So the frog's been kicked out of the pond and we're ready to get back. Thanks, Juanita.
Thank you. Thanks, Suzanne. Apologies, everyone. Okay, so there are essentially 4 committee member duties, and they're on the screen now. There's the duty to act in good faith for a proper purpose, the duty to act with reasonable care, skill and diligence, which includes, as we'll talk about, a particular focus on financials and insolvent trading, the duty not to misuse position or information, and everyone's favourite, conflicts of interest. Sometimes they're grouped differently, but we'll talk about them this way today. And it's important to acknowledge that as well as applying to committee members, some of them also apply to former committee members. So even when you've stepped off the committee, they can still apply, and they apply to officers as well. So if you've got senior staff, executive staff, they'll apply. Okay, let's talk about the first duty, the duty to act in good faith and for a proper purpose. And this is really about being loyal and fair and honest. And an example of not acting in good faith, which is a bit of an old-fashioned term really, but an example of not doing that would be fraud, for example. Not good faith, not good faith. Now, this duty also requires a committee member to act in the best interests of the organisation. And someone mentioned that earlier in the chat about acting in the best interests of the organisation. I can't remember who it was, but it was, Angela, thank you. And that's absolutely right. That's crucial to this duty. And what that really means is that committee members must make decisions based on what's best for the organisation as a whole, not for their own personal interests or for the interests of someone else close to them or another organisation that they're involved in. Now, this can be a bit tricky for committee members who've been elected to the committee to represent certain interests. So, for example, just say you've got a district association and they've got a spot on the committee for someone from a local traders group, right? And you've been elected to the committee specifically because of your trading expertise and your ability to represent those trader interests. Now, they may have elected you to sit on the committee, but once you're there, your duty is to the organisation as a whole and to act in the best interests and make decisions on the basis of the best interests of the organization as a whole. So you can't prioritize, the people who elected you or your particular, positioning into the committee. You must think about what's best for the organization as a whole. And sometimes that might mean that in that particular example, that a person would need to act against the interests of, the people, the trader group or whatever who elected them, in order to make sure that they were really legitimately making decisions in the best interests of the organization as a whole. Proper purpose is also a word here. That's critical. And when we talk about purpose, we talk about knowing what the purpose of the organization is. So referring back to that constitution and making sure that any restrictions on the powers of the committee are observed. I've got here on that dot point 2, check your motivation. What hat are you wearing? So that's just a really useful kind of flag, I suppose, for, how would this decision look if you were looking at it from the outside? Does it feel like a reasonable decision for a committee member to have made? Okay, the second one is to act with reasonable care, skill, and diligence. And this is about taking your role seriously and making sure that you're contributing actively and making good use of your skills. People might like to put in the chat about what this kind of might look like in practice, but it can include, not doing groupthink and, really interrogating these decisions that need to be made so that you're getting the best outcome for the organisation as a whole. You don't have to get everything perfect, though. It's important that the law will recognise that, with the benefit of hindsight, a committee might say, oh gosh, that wasn't the best decision. We should have done Project X instead of Project Y. The law's not going to punish a committee for making a decision which in hindsight wasn't perhaps the best decision to make, but really the standard here is, was this a reasonable decision for the committee to make at the time that they made it, and with the information that was available to them or should have been, that made available to them, i.e. that they appropriately scoped it, they had material before them that was appropriate to the decision, and they made the decision fairly, validly, honestly at the time. That's what's required for this duty. An important part of this duty is also to take care on finances. So many of you will be aware of the concept of insolvent trading. That is when an organisation is unable to pay its debts as and when they fall due, and it is squarely within the committee's responsibilities to make sure that if the organisation is getting into tough ground there, if it's looking a bit scary and like the organisation won't be able to pay its debts as and when they fall due, the committee's responsibility is really to put the brakes on spending ASAP and get professional help to make sure that there's no insolvency. Okay, we're just going to go through, and this scenario provides an opportunity to just flesh out these duties a little bit, and I'll just ask Suzanne to read this and then we can have a discussion.
Yes, everybody can read through it, but I'm going to give your eyes a little bit of a rest and read it to you so that you can think about it as I do that. You are on the committee of Team Old Town Incorporated. You were voted onto the committee as a person who could represent the views of bar owners in the district. You own a bar on Big Street. Team Old Town Incorporated wants to commission an artist to paint a mural on a key street in the district to attract more visitors and celebrate local culture. There are 2 site options, one on Little Street and another on Big Street, on the side of your bar. You've skimmed the paperwork for the committee meeting, but you don't need to read the pros and cons for each site because you've already made up your mind. The mural should, of course, be on Big Street. Surely that's what the bar owners of Uptown would want, and they voted you onto the committee, so you should do right by them first and foremost, yes?
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne. So what do you think? We've got one, I'm not sure what this person's name is. Apologies, just because of the Zoom. But I've got that's not acting in good faith. Yes, I think that's
It's
interesting.
Lee, I think. Yes. Lee.
Yes. Yep. Our name is Lee. Thank you so much, Lee. Yep, not acting impartially. Fantastic. And so this would be that first duty. Yeah. Jackie says each representative comes into the group to represent the interests of the group, not the group that they represent. Yeah, right. That's great. So here we've got a person who is, at risk of straying into an area where they're making decisions not on the basis of what is best for the organization as a whole, but either, potentially what is good for them as an owner of a bar on Big Street, or even the interests of bar owners who elected that person to the committee. Great, fantastic. So yeah, very important not to allow personal interests or those of others in your group, I suppose, or your kind of representative group to override the interests of the organization as a whole. There is a little bit of a conflict of interest overlap here if there were, and I think that Raymond has identified that potentially this person stands to personally benefit if there's going to be, increased business as a result of a really beautiful mural right on the side of that person's bar. Also, what about the skimming the paperwork? What do you think about that one? That might be a potential risk in terms of the duty to act with reasonable care, skill, and diligence. Yeah, not due diligence. Fantastic. Yeah, really important to read the papers and not pre-make decisions in the absence of analysing, the material that's put before the committee. Great, thank you. All right, let's look at the other two duties, the duty not to misuse position or information and conflicts of interests. So just this first one, you can't use your position as a committee member or information that you obtain because of that position. So for example, information raised at committee meetings or in the papers, to gain a personal advantage for yourself or any other person that's close to you, or to cause detriment, to cause harm to the organisation itself. Some examples of a misuse of position or information might be accepting kickbacks, free dinners from a business that's tendering for work for your organisation, that sort of thing. If you're using your position to get a benefit that's not appropriate. Using your position to pull some strings for a mate that wants a particular, deal with the organisation. Another one is making comments in the public domain on behalf of the organisation when you're not actually authorised to make those statements. So that would be a misuse of position and information. Any questions there? Okay, conflicts of interest. Let's move on to that. And conflicts of interest, can I just say, are not prohibited per se. There are many conflicts of interests that take place, especially in the community setting. And, they can actually be really good if they're managed well, because, for example, just say you're an organisation that's, doing a fundraiser and someone on your board runs a catering company and they're like, well, I'll give really heavily discounted catering because I care about this organisation. Like that can be a useful thing for an organisation. But the critical thing is, how is that decision made? And making sure that the person who has the conflict is not involved in that decision-making process. So that's essentially at the heart of this duty around disclosing and managing conflicts of interest. So what do you need to do? You need three things. You need to disclose your conflict, if you have one, to the committee as soon as you become aware of it, whether it's an actual conflict of interest or just perhaps could be a potential one. Really important to disclose and really err on the side of disclosing so that the committee can have a robust conversation about what it's going to do about that. Secondly, you need to manage that conflict, which means taking steps to address it. A committee member would usually not be present at the committee meeting where that is discussed and should not vote on that matter, and not otherwise influence the decision of the committee. Now, really, in reality, 99 times out of 100, that means that that committee member would remove themselves from the board room or from the committee meeting in order for that discussion and decision making to take place. And really, from a best practice perspective, that should always happen, is that the person with the conflict says, hello, you know, I perceive a conflict. I've got a business interest that potentially, you know, interacts with my role as a committee member. I'm going to step out of this meeting while you can discuss and make this decision because I'm conflicted. And the third thing you need to do is to record that happened. So if you ever are asked to defend the organisation's actions, you've got a record in the minutes that, you know, X person disclosed their interest, left the meeting room, discussion ensued, decision was made, and that person returned after the decision was made. Okay. Okay, let's do another scenario. Oh, sorry. I forgot to click there, but let's do another scenario to really bring this to life. Suzanne.
Thanks, Juanita. Okay, Team Old Town Incorporated has recently allocated funding to procure marketing advice on how to best attract customers to the district. You are on the committee. You are tasked with considering which consultant would be best for the marketing job. You notice that the budget allocation for the consultancy is less than any of the quotes you have received. You'd like to contact a friend who does this kind of work. They might do it at mates rates, as they run a business in which you have some shares. You plan to let them know how much the other quotes are so that they can quote competitively. Meanwhile, unforeseen costs have recently been coming in, and you're not 100% sure the organisation should prioritise this marketing work right now. What should you think about? Let's see what people think.
Okay. Yes. Any observations? Yep. Conflict of interest, Lee. How do you think that conflict of interest arises here? Yep, financial mismanagement and in-kind support. Yeah. Okay. There's a bit of a conflict of interest, I think, because this person has shares in their friend's consultancy. So if that consultancy gets this job, then they potentially stand to gain from that through their shareholding of in the consultancy. So that would be a conflict of interest, and that person should be disclosing that they have shares in their friend's business and not participating in that decision-making process. There's also a bit of a question about, disclosing competitive quotes is a no-go. Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Misuse of information. If you've got information that's kind of commercially sensitive or that sort of thing, or, you know the inside goss on how a particular committee decision-making process is going to run, then it's not appropriate to share that information externally, and particularly with a person who is interested in tendering for that opportunity and stands to personally gain from that. Yep. And then we've got another one around operating while insolvent there in that final paragraph, because unforeseen costs have recently come in, and that committee member should be thinking about whether or not the organisation has the financial capacity to do this work right now. Really important part of the committee's role. Okay. Yep, thank you. I just wanted to just cover off on a couple of these questions. Firstly, the one earlier about conflicts of interest and paid staff. Now, if it might be a situation where it's a once off, where a person who is paid on a project once off kind of consultancy basis or whatever might be able to just remove themselves from that decision-making process and manage that conflict of interest appropriately. But generally speaking, if there is, particularly an executive or a leadership role taken by a committee member, then that can present real challenges for dealing with conflicts of interest in an ongoing sense, because sort of, it can just make things very complicated. So most organizations decide that when, if there's a person who is on the committee and then takes up a role as a senior paid staff member, that person will resign from the committee in order to manage any problems with conflict of interest there. I hope that answers that question. But if the committee says it is okay, well, I guess, Nick, probably need a little bit more information from you about which bit would be okay. But I would be suggesting that if the committee wants to run a proper process here, that it would be not appropriate for the committee to give preferential treatment to a particular consultant who might throw their hat in the ring for this job. Jackie, can you speak to the conflicts of interest to register and how to properly disclose conflicts of interest? Thank you. Yes, I can. So some organisations will deal with conflicts of interest by having a register of interests that is a standing agenda on every committee meeting. It's a register of, what other companies a committee member is a part of, any spouse interests as well, often, or children, close family members. And that's just a rolling list to be a sort of a prompt, I suppose, for the organisation to consider, if there's any interaction with any of these other entities or interests, then, that's a conversation around conflict of interest right up front. And then obviously as well, as the organisation does its business meeting to meeting, a conflict might come up in the course of conversation that's not actually on the register. And of course, that is also a situation where a committee member would need to disclose. Okay, so I think that's probably about all we have time for on conflicts of interest, but I'm happy to, we'll have hopefully some time for questions at the very end. So happy to come back to this if people want to. Just quickly to end off this section, then we will have a break. In terms of how a committee member can protect themselves, well, of course, the first protection is to comply with the duties, which I hope you've seen are fairly common sense. And I feel like from the chat discussions, you've got already a pretty good radar for the level of, fiduciary duty and the sorts of actions and behaviours that would be expected of committee members. So that's the easiest and cheapest way to protect yourself. As we've mentioned throughout this session so far, evidence is really important. So having good minutes, explaining how you've dealt with conflicts of interest and that sort of thing will hold you in good stead if anyone ever accuses you of doing something wrong. Some organisations will have an indemnity, which basically means that the organisation will pay committee members back if they are out of pocket for, defending a legal action or something. That's an optional thing in New South Wales. So You might like to think about what level of support you're going to provide to your committee members for costs incurred in the course of performing their role. And many organisations, finally, will take out insurance. So directors and officers liability insurance is the really key one here, protects directors being committee members and officers being senior staff. So that's the critical option for many organisations, but very much a last resort option as well. So check the policy wording and make sure you know what you're covered for. There are other types of insurance which can also protect, obviously. Okay. I think that's probably it for this part of the session. So if everyone would like to just have a little break, get some, I'll be having another sip of my water to prevent any frogs from coming back. But if you want to go off and have a quick stretch of the legs, we'll come back at 11, I think we said a couple of minutes. So 11:22.
3-minute break. Sorry to be so stingy with the break, but there's lots more to cover. So quick stretch and a drink and come on back for the exciting next installment, which is contracts and IP.
Awesome.
See you soon. Welcome back, everybody. Hope that very, very stingy little break was enough to revitalize you for the next part of the session. So we're going to be talking a little bit now about a concept which is perhaps a bit more tangible than some of the governance discussion that we've had, and that is around contracts and IP. Although maybe for many of you it's just as new conceptually. And the reason that we start thinking about contracts and IP in the context of organizations is that for many organizations, having good written contracts is one of the ways that they manage risk within the organization. They are the demonstration of some of that good governance through having documented the way in which you're going to work with others. So we'll flick across to the first little slide there and talk a bit about what contracts actually are. Now, this is going to be a very, very quick introduction to the concept of contracts, I should say. Ordinarily, you know, we would deliver a workshop on contracts, and that could be a 2-hour workshop on its own. So this is a little intro just to start thinking about some of the context. So a contract is really a binding agreement between two or more parties that they're going to do or not do certain things. And in order for a valid contract to exist, you have to have an offer that's made. So, you know, for example, your district association asks someone to come and paint that mural that we were talking about. So you can offer to pay that person $5,000 for that work. And you also need acceptance of that offer. So somebody says, okay, yes, the artist says, yes, okay, I will paint the mural. So that's their acceptance. And then you also need what the law calls consideration, which is really very often money, but it's you sort of proving that you're very serious about sticking to your offer and your acceptance, and that you're both very serious about doing what you say you're going to do by giving the other person something. So in the case of the scenario with the artist that paints the mural that we talked about earlier, that would be the artist promising to paint the mural and the district association offering to pay the $5,000. And then lastly, you also need to both have the intention of entering into a legal relationship. So just thinking a bit more about verbal agreements, because very often, you know, your district association might be running around doing 1,000 things. You're really busy. You've got a lot on the go, and somebody has a phone call with an external provider, an external service provider, and makes an arrangement for something to be done. So would the verbal agreement be binding in that situation? Just jump into the chat and tell me whether you think conversations can be contracts. Do you think a verbal conversation can be an agreement? While you're doing that, somebody said maybe. Someone said, I don't think so. So, and someone said, yes, but it's got to be documented somehow. Look, that's really good, Angela, because a verbal agreement can be a binding agreement, but the problem is that human beings aren't very good at recalling verbal conversations, and we often aren't very good at both understanding the same thing from a conversation. So a verbal agreement can be a binding contract, but it can be a very unclear one that can often lead to disputes. So it's always a good thing to follow up with the paperwork in the form of a written agreement. And that could be a very simple document. It doesn't have to be drafted by a lawyer. It also doesn't have to be a really complex, you know, that tiny size 8 font and 12 pages long, or 70 pages long sometimes. It can be a very simple written agreement that sets out what you do and don't agree to. So the fourth bullet point there, which is what is an MOU and what is an agreement? This is something that we're very often asked by incorporated associations. An MOU is an acronym for Memorandum of Understanding. And a memo of understanding is really where you talk about what you both aspire to achieve together through the relationship that you have, but it doesn't ordinarily set out the sort of binding or forceful or obligatory language that a contract does. So the idea of an agreement is that it makes you do something or not do something, whereas an MOU ordinarily is used to sort of talk about what you aim to do with someone else, but not be a legally binding document. You've got to be a bit careful because the way that you name a document, whether you name it an MOU or an agreement, is not as important as the sort of language that you use in the body of that document. So you've got to think carefully about whether you're talking about aiming to do something with someone else or obliging somebody to do a particular thing or not do a particular thing. And the contract needs to make that clear. So why are contracts important? Can you throw me some ideas in the chat there about why? I mean, of course, I think contracts are important. I'm a lawyer and I work with contracts all the time, but I'm more interested in why it is that you think contracts might be important in the context of your district association. I gave you a couple at the beginning, so you've had a little head start. Yep, someone said they're binding. And I presume from that, Nick, that I'm going to put words in your chat, if you don't mind, that it creates those binding obligations so that you can rely on someone actually doing the thing that they're saying they're going to do. Sandy said it provides clarity to the expectations and outcomes that have been agreed to. Absolutely. And Lee, thank you. All parties have an understanding in writing of what's happening, and it's also legally binding. Yep, absolutely. Gives you that clarity. And, you know, your district association is going to be doing so many exciting things that unless you've got strong written agreements about those various aspects of your operations, it can also get really confusing. You know, years down the track, you might have a question about what your rights or obligations are in respect of a particular third party. And if you don't have an agreement to go back to and revisit, you might be emailing someone going, oh, just wanting to check, you know, we worked together like 3 years ago, but I've got this question and we never actually resolved it at the start of our relationship, and it can catch you a bit short. So it is good to make sure that you've got all of those aspects of your agreement down in writing. As I said at the beginning, it is part of that good governance. It's a part of managing your risks. It gives you an ability very often to look into the future of what you want the relationship to be and to manage any risks that you think might come into the relationship contractually as well. So, and it gives you that nice proof that you are doing things the right way, that you're engaging with people the right way. So the next thing for us to think about is, well, what sorts of contracts do district associations actually enter into? What sorts of agreements do you think district associations might need to be thinking about? So, I mean, even if you just think about the very start of a district association, what sorts of contracts do you think you might be entering into? I'm really getting people to work hard in the chat. Apologies. Straight after a break. It's a bit rough. Events. Yep. Venue booking forms, venue booking agreements, all of the complexities. Yes, activations, absolutely. Your catering, your venue, your staff, artist commissions. Yep, absolutely, Sophie. Thank you. You know, anyone who's got any district association with a Facebook account has entered into an agreement. You've looked at those terms and conditions, I'm sure, in great detail, and you've ticked, yes, I agree to the terms and conditions. You've just made a contract with Meta when you do that. And I can see there are licenses included there in Lee's response. Influencers, Jackie, I'm so pleased you included that one. So these agreements don't only pertain to the way in which you hold in-person events, they also pertain to the way in which you generate, use, and exploit, for want of a better word, your content as an organization. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. Okay, fantastic. So we'll go to that next slide. Thank you. And thank you for your brainstorming there. One of the contracts that you might not automatically think about, but are those sort of pivotal initial agreement that a district association might be entering into, is a funding or grant agreement. And that's where you are making an agreement with perhaps a government agency or a sponsor who will give you money on the basis that you agree you're going to do certain things with that money. So that would be your funding agreement. And those funding agreements very often will include aspects that pertain to the way in which you might govern your organization. So it's very important that you read and understand what those agreements say. They're also going to include aspects that dictate how you acquit your funding. So at the end of your funding, you're going to need to go back to whoever it was that funded you, if it was a government agency, federal or state, and say, well, yep, we've done all the things that we said that we would do, and here's the proof, here's the evidence of that. Okay, the other sorts of agreements include things like employment contracts. So a district association might be employing a CEO or an artistic director for a project, and so making sure that your employment contracts are not only sound and in writing, but they're also compliant with the employment laws in New South Wales. You might also have contracts for particular services. So somebody mentioned an event, someone else mentioned influencers. They might be providing certain services to your district association, and you want to make sure that the things that you want from that relationship are clearly set out in the written agreement. You might also have a lease agreement for a venue that you're going to operate out of, or an office space, or your location or venue agreements for events, and then your creative contracts for performances or commissions. So I feel like you all sort of did half of my job for me on that slide, because you did such a good job of the brainstorming. So thinking carefully, I suppose one of the ways of managing risks around contracts is really to think about the matrix of all of those agreements that your organization might be entering into. And if you're on the board of a district association, or the committee, to really think about how well the organization is managing all of those various relationships, and whether you have contracts to represent the way in which the relationship is going to work. Because of course, if you don't have good agreements that deal with the way that relationships can work, to some extent, it's sort of guessing. So we're going to talk a bit briefly now also about intellectual property. And again, this is a topic that could be a 2-hour presentation on its own as well. But one of the areas that we often at the Arts Law Centre get questions about from incorporated associations or from small not-for-profits is about what is broadly called IP, or intellectual property. And that's an umbrella term for a whole lot of different protections that the Australian legal system gives over products of the mind. Things like artistic works, things like logos and designs or patents, and plant breeders' rights, which is definitely beyond the scope of this presentation, but it basically deals with the protection of the way in which certain genetically modified plants are protected. And I only explained that to you because Lee asked. So So we're going to talk a bit more about copyright, because for many organizations, part of how you're going to tell other people about what you do is through the creation of content. And I know that you've done some really fabulous sessions as part of the build-up to your pitching and all of the thinking that you've been doing, and that a couple of those sessions have related to marketing and communications and how to tell other people about your wonderful idea. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, because really, in order for you to share information about what you're doing as an organization, you are probably going to be creating, using, or sharing copyright material. So let's go to the next slide and chat through what copyright actually is. So copyright protection is given under the Copyright Act in Australia, which is a piece of law that automatically gives creators of material rights in their film or song or piece of writing. And as I say, the rights are automatic. So we don't have a system like they do in the States of registration. That means that at the time that the district association authors its, the documents that it's going to use to build its own website, or authors the post that it's going to put up on Facebook, takes the photo that it's going to post onto Instagram, at the time that those things are created, the Copyright Act automatically protects them. And so what copyright is the right to copy or use the work. So this means that if you want to use copyright material that somebody else owns, you will need permission to do that. And that permission is called a license. Importantly, copyright doesn't protect ideas. So this means that you might need to think quite carefully as a district association about the way in which you share information, and consider whether, in particular relationships, using something called a confidentiality agreement to protect those ideas. Now, Arts Law has got a number of information sheets on these topics that you can have a look at, including on copyright and on confidentiality. And there's also a template copyright agreement on the Arts Law website if you're interested. That's not included in the materials that are posted to the information hub. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we need to think now about how this relates to your district association, and what it means when we're talking about content. Now, content means different things in the current context, but broadly, what I'm talking about when I use the word content is written or artistic or photographic or film material that communicates ideas about your district association, or a particular concept or an event that you're holding, or a product that you're developing. And so that content is your way of talking to the rest of the world about what you're doing. So from a legal perspective, content is usually going to fall into the category of those things that are protected by the Copyright Act. So it will usually include things like photographs or videos or written materials. And it might also include trademarks like logos or brand names. So you should really think about, when you're engaging someone else to create content for your district association, you've really got to have a think about who is going to own that content, and also how they are going to share the content, or how you are going to share the content. Is it confidential? Is the information that you're sharing, in order for the content to be developed, confidential information? Is it publicly known? And really thinking about relationships with people who you are charging the responsibility to share the content, like influencers. So in the influencer scenario, and I'll just explain this a bit because somebody raised it as one of the sorts of contracts that they thought a district association might need to have a relationship with. You are going to need to consider what the role of the influencer is in promoting the brand or the event or the concept, and what your critical markers or identifiers or key performance indicators for them doing that will be. And your contract needs to talk about what those things will be. So whether it's, you know, a requirement that they post at least 10 times about the event, and that they provide you with evidence that that's what they've done, whether it's that they appear at the event or whether they speak in a particular media opportunity about the event. So being very, very clear with everybody about what their roles and responsibilities are. And getting some advice if what you are doing is wanting to actually look at how to protect your organization's IP as well. Considering things like whether you should have a trademark over the name of the organization, and what IP might mean for your organization. So seeking that advice as an individual entity. And sorry, I skipped over the second last bullet point there, which was really around understanding that when you are using social media across any of the platforms, whether you're on a website, you're generally operating under the terms and conditions of that platform. And they aren't things that are hidden away, you know, in secret. They're very accessible on any of the Meta platforms. You can very easily find the terms and conditions, and they will talk about what rights you are giving the platform at the time that you post the content. The reason that I'm suggesting that is not as a cure for insomnia, because they can sometimes be very, very, you know, dry to read through. But rather because when you are getting permissions from other people to use material that they are creating, you are going to need to get permissions that will also cover you for any third-party social media use. So the rights or permissions that you're getting are going to need to match up, basically. Okay. So as I say, that was a very, very quick fly-by-night description of how contracts and IP work. If that's something that people are keen to know a bit more about, please do head to the Arts Law website and have a look at the information that we've got there for you. And I'll hand back over to Anita now to talk about risk management.
Suzanne, can I just quickly ask a question?
Yes.
So when I was building out the technology platform, one of the things we did and were advised to do, and I'm just asking whether this applies the same or not, when it came to things like branding or imagery or getting someone external to develop something for us, we got them to assign the IP to us so that we were the owners of any IP associated with imagery and things like that that have been produced by them. So even if we were using someone on Fiverr, we got them to just fill in and sign a document that assigned the IP. Is that something you would recommend as well in this case?
I'll just explain for all the players in the room what an assignment is, and then I'll answer the question. Okay. So an assignment is where you get somebody to give away their copyright to you so that you become the new holder of the copyright. And the answer to the question, Kelly, about whether or not it's necessary for people to do that is going to depend on the type of IP that's being developed and the purpose of the development of that IP. So it's, you know, if somebody was, for example, creating a logo that was going to be used by a district association on a daily basis as part of their brand identity, then I think in that situation, it would be entirely reasonable for them to ask the creator of the logo to assign the rights in that logo, because it's going to, that the logo would need to be used really exclusively by the district association. However, if what the district association was going to do was to work with an artist, you know, let's go back to our mural scenario, where we're getting an artist to create a mural that's going to sit on a wall somewhere, that artist would hold copyright in that mural. And I think in that scenario, asking that person to assign the copyright in the mural would be entirely unnecessary and not best practice from an artist contracting perspective. So I'm sorry that there isn't a sort of one size fits all answer to that. It really depends on what's being created and what the purpose of the content is. And I think the other thing is that from a best practice perspective, also thinking about whether you need to be the owner of the copyright for that particular project, whether that makes sense for you, or whether it's actually, whether you're better off to have the copyright holder just give you a limited permission. So that's also going to depend on the price tag, because it's a bit like selling or renting a house. If you're asking somebody to give you the whole house, that's going to cost a bit more, quite a lot more. And if you're only asking for a very limited permission to use the rights in the form of a license, it should cost less, and the scope of what you can and can't do will be set out in that arrangement.
Makes
So great
sense. Thank
question.
you.
Sorry, there's not a simple answer to it. All right, back over to Juanita to talk about risk management.
Thanks, Suzanne. And, in the spirit of what Suzanne said about contracts and IP, this also could be a 2-hour session. So I'm going to go super quick on this. It's really just a round out to make this this risk management piece that the committee is responsible for, and some of those key risks that Suzanne has mentioned around contracting and IP, just to round that out with a little bit of information about a process that the committee can oversee to make sure that it's identifying and dealing with any risks, including contracts and that sort of thing, but also other risks as well. So regardless of the size of the organisation, it is important for all groups to consider risk, and it is very much something that the committee should have on its radar as a part of its good governance function. But the way that risk management will actually play out in practice is obviously going to depend on the size of the organisation and what it's actually doing. There are a number of different ways to manage risk, and we often think about, risk management as being, preventing a risk or mitigating its consequences. But you could also just simply decide not to do a thing, which is decided to be kind of too risky. And an example of that would be illegal activities. Many organisations will simply decide that under the name of the organisation, no one will be breaking the law because it's too risky from a compliance perspective. And so that's a very rudimentary example of avoidance of certain behaviours as a process of risk management. On the other hand, you might accept a risk, a bad weather event at a festival. It's something that you're not going to not do the festival just because you have that bad weather event or a minor upset to the course of events might also come into play as a risk that you might accept. And there are obviously lots of legal risks, but there are also other categories. So it's important to take a holistic lens on this risk management piece. Now, classically, a risk management process involves 4 steps, and they go round and round in a circle. So once you identify risks and evaluate them, you design a risk management program, and then you review and iterate it, and then you go back to identifying new risks as a result of that review, and then you go through the steps again. So it's not a set and forget, it's a sort of a loop process. There's lots of information available out, lots of templates and kits and things. Just Google risk management for community organisations and you'll come up with lots of different kind of guides and templates around that. And some of those are noted in our governance guide too. Basically, you need to, first of all, though, identify the risks, obviously. The evaluation step is typically done through a risk matrix. You might have seen that before, where you identify your risks and then you rate them. How likely is this risk to happen? And then if it did happen, what would be the consequence for the organisation? And then you can create by giving the likelihood and the consequence ratings scores, you can come up with an overall risk score that helps you identify which are your biggest risks and where does the committee really need to spend its energy and attention. Not all risks are equal, if you like, and in the best of all possible worlds, you'd have oodles of money to measure and manage every risk, but really the committee needs to determine which ones are the most likely to have a significant impact and focus on those at the first instance. Then you need to design what you're going to do about it. And that can be either at the activity level, so you might have a risk management plan for an event, or you might have a risk management framework for the whole organisation, incorporating all aspects, staffing, activities, governance, IT, the lot. So risk management can operate at different levels. And obviously then, as I say, you're iterating it, you're checking out whether it's working, you're identifying any new risks, and that can be done through a number of different mechanisms within your organisation. Just quickly, this is sort of an example of sort of a worked example, if you like, of a risk matrix. So here on the left-hand side, we've got the name of the risk. So we've done that first step of identifying the key risks of the organisation. The second column is existing controls. What are we already doing to manage this risk? And then you've got your likelihood and your consequence ratings, which would typically be attached to a number, which would spit out an overall risk rating. And that's there as the traffic light column. And then so that analysis enables a committee to identify, well, look, harm to or from workers at an event is actually our highest risk at the moment. And what are we going to do about that more than over and above what we're doing at the moment? So there's some suggestions there. Of course, this is just an example, just a hypothetical, but it might be that the committee says, well, we're going to start up a training program, or we're going to have a different policy in place, or we're going to review various touch points within the organisation to make sure we've improved our risk management on that. Many of you will be familiar with these sorts of things, I'm sure. So I did want to just, I guess, wrap this all up with this scenario, just to bring it all to life, which includes some of the scenario that incorporates some of the things that we've discussed. So Team Old Town is an incorporated association who employs Abdul as coordinator. The organisation has a grant of $5,000 to hold a district celebration day, which is open to members of the public on council-managed parkland near a popular dining strip. Abdul is also a professional photographer in his spare time. Team Old Town is keen to have Abdul film and take the photographs. Planned activities at the district celebration day include roving performances, taste testers, a splash park. There's 2,000 people expected to attend, including families and young people, and there's hot weather. So there's going to be some good photo opportunities. Would people in the chat like to just have a bit of a go at spotting the issues here? We just want a quick rapid fire in the chat of what sorts of risks in this scenario would need to be thought through by the organisation before they proceed with the district celebration day. Go! Safety, fantastic. Yes, work health and safety, a crucial one, especially with that slippery slide for children. Transport and access. Thank you, Sandy. Yep. Toilets, yes, all the facilities to make sure that people who are attending are safe. Emergency service act. What about the type of people who are attending? Would you need to do anything there? If you've got, things that are entertaining children, public liability insurance in place. Yes, what insurances would you need? Public liability is going to be critical there. Working with children's checks. Thank you. Need public liability. Yes, so there's children around. Have your, slippery dip people got working with children checks. Can Abdul be both a coordinator and a photographer? Would you like to speak to that one, Suzanne?
Sure.
I think and just noting the time, we've got 3 more minutes, so everybody's been very quick, but we'll be winding up soon. Abdul could be both the photographer and the coordinator, but the basis upon which he delivers those services as the photographer are going to need to be very clearly set out in a written agreement. And the scope of his employment as a coordinator on the project is also going to need to be very clearly set out, so that those two things don't conflict with each other. And he knows whether or not he's supposed to be going and checking that the slippery slide is arriving or taking photographs, so that he's not trying to be 2 people at once. So just being aware of that. I can see people have come in with lots of great ideas.
Fantastic list, and actually most of the ones on this on the list there are the ones that I had noted down. So a really great list. Thank you to all who contributed, and that's the sort of process that you'd be going through around an event like this, both from the project manager perspective, but also the committee, making sure that those things are being done. Okay. So just here, we're coming right to the end now, and just a quick flag of some good resources that are out there on the governance aspects in particular. Fair Trading, Justice Connect's not-for-profit law team have hundreds of resources for community organisations on governance and legal issues. And our community has a lot too, in particular, a free policy bank if you're wanting to get a template policy on any of the matters that we've been discussing. I think a number of them are there for the download. Suzanne?
And if you wanted to find out more about what Arts Law does, please head to our website, artslaw.com.au, and have a little look at the materials that we've got on that site. I've mentioned a couple of them during the presentation. And look, just really wanting to thank everybody in the group. Thank you, Juanita, for all of that sharing and information. Many thanks to the 24-Hour Economy Commissioner for working with us again this year and offering the sessions, and to Kelly and her team for the coordination, and to all of you for your incredible participation and engagement in the chat and all of those wonderful questions throughout the workshop. So hoping that everybody has a wonderful day. Kelly, I'll just hand to you to make sure that there's not anything that you need to say before I say goodbye.
Awesome. Suzanne, Juanita, thank you so much. Like, you really do simplify what feels like a very overwhelming and complex process. And like you said, sometimes a little bit dry. You do bring the glitter to it and make it interesting. And also, like I said, simplifying it, which is absolute gold. So thank you for your time. Everyone, just a huge thank you. You've already, Lee says that was a great session. And so did Sophie and a few others. So thanks. Just quickly, guys, conscious of time, we have this Friday, we have the blueprint for creating amazing events with Louisa Thomas from the Public Sector Network. She has created millions of dollars worth of events over the years and is actually working on the Bad District event coming up in a couple of weeks. So she's done massive global events, international, but she's also done local district events as well. So she's going to have a wealth of knowledge to share with you around events. We also make sure you've got your session booked in with Peter for those of you that are speaking or pitching next week. Tech rehearsals for the speakers are on Monday from 9 till 12 or 1 till 5. Rachel will drop the links in the chat. Make sure you book in. And then dress rehearsals for the speakers go from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Tuesday, the 24th. So tech rehearsals on Monday, dress rehearsals on Tuesday, and then we have the event on the Tuesday night. Any questions on that? All good? Latha, Anson, have I missed anything?
No, all good. Thank you so
Awesome.
much, Suzanne and Juanita. That was awesome.
It was so good. All right. Have a wonderful Monday, people, and we will see you on Friday. You'll get a recap and reminder from Rachel with all of this information in it. Thanks, Rachel. Bye.